I'm going to stay a little closer to home here and talk about these beasties. I took this photo at the Adams River this fall. If you didn't go to the Adams River to see the sockeye salmon, you will have to wait 4 more years until there will be another big run like that. It was quite spectacular. I'm going to talk about salmon for a couple of reasons. One is that I think they provide a really good microcosm for a lot of the conflicts that we see in our relationship with animals in freshwater and also marine ecosystems and the different values we place on them. And also, of course, because lately they've been in the news quite a lot because they have this habit of surprising us. We seem to have managed to find a way to go from one of the worst years on record for Fraser sockeye last year to the best year on record for Fraser sockeye back to back. And nobody saw the first one coming, nobody saw this one coming, I must confess. And it makes it rather interesting days to be a pseudo salmon biologist. So I'll see what we can do about that first. I'll tell you about what we think we know about the status of salmon and so on. But then I want to take probably the last couple of minutes when I get my 2-minute warning. I'll switch gears a bit more and see what we can take from this more broadly about issues to do with the trade-offs that we may have in our different views of what these sorts of animals are actually for. So you know, I think there are 5 main species, 5 species of salmon on our coast. They all die after spawning, and I'm not going to go into much detail about any of that. I'm going to be focusing in particular on the sockeye salmon that you see up in the corner here. That's in the right-hand, on your right-hand corner, because they are the most valuable ones commercially, but they're also the ones that are always in the news because they are the ones that seem to have minds of their own in terms of how well they're going to survive into the future. Did you know that there are more salmon right now in the Pacific Ocean than in any time since records began? Here's a time series from 1920s up until near the present of the millions of fish being caught. These are in the Pacific Rim, right around the rim, including Japan, Russia, and over into Alaska and our further down our way. And so this isn't just because we're hammering them harder than we ever used to. This is actually reflective of the fact that there are a lot of fish there. Which is a surprise to most people. It's not the story you normally hear. And the other day somebody reminded me that an optimist is someone who isn't fully in possession of the facts. So I'm afraid I have to give you some more facts. It's driven by the northerly stocks. The northern stocks of the species of salmon are doing very well, not just sockeye. Okay, pinks, chums as well, for example. So in Alaska is where a lot of the good news is. If you come down to BC, you can see that, in fact, we've been in some trouble in total here since about the early 1990s. There's been some ups and downs lately, and it's even worse if you go down to Washington, Oregon, and California. So there's a real north-south thing here, and in a nutshell, it's because the seas are more favorable to the survival of these fish when they're juveniles in the north right now than in the south. That isn't always the case, but in the current oceanic conditions we have, it's better to be a sockeye in Alaska, aside from the fact that there are people trying to catch you and eat you, than it is to be a Chinook in California. But if you take another way of looking at this, if you look at the IUCN, so this is the same body that Nick is co-chairing their committee on elasmobranchs, on sharks and rays. If you look at their status report for fish, basically red and purple are very bad, and good would be green, and you can see that trend here. You have a lot of threatened stocks down in the States, and the U.S. is not shy about putting a stock of salmon onto their endangered species list and protecting them. Unlike the Canadian government, which so far has refused to do that, even when their own independent body, CSIWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, lists them officially as being endangered. So far, we have not put any salmon under the protection of the Federal Species at Risk Act. Here's one of the poster childs for how when everything that can go wrong does. This is the Cultus Lake sockeye. At one time, there were 80 or so thousand of these fish coming back to Cultus Lake. Cultus Lake, you'll know, is just up the Fraser Valley a bit from here. And these numbers have gone down under the eyes, right under our noses. They've been watched very carefully with accounting facilities and so on. And this is due largely to the fact that they have the misfortune of swimming upstream at the same time as some of the bigger stronger stocks, which are the subject of the more important commercial fisheries. So they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they are really an example of the problems that you can have in these kinds of fisheries, and there is a lot of effort being made to keep these. Basically, they're pretty much on life support system right now through a dedicated hatchery program. Just to give you a couple of other quick examples before I spend most of my time on the Fraser, here's the Skeena River, which is Canada's second most important watershed for salmon. And it's not just one river, I should say. It is this is the aggregate for all of the tributaries to the Skeena. And you can see that they've been the total return, which is the total number of fish that come back, some of which will be caught, some of which will go on to spawn. But the total number coming back did go up through up into the early to mid-90s, and it's been coming down ever since. And I do pay some attention to this timing. Where are we seeing here? We're looking at sort of 95-ish, after which things started to go downward. If you look at Barkley Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there is a similar sort of pattern where things have not been so good for the last 15 years. The Columbia River, now this one is interesting. These are the fish that use Soyos Lake as their nursery. So sockeye salmon, in most places, do spend 1 year as juveniles in a lake before then they go to sea. And any of you who've been to a Soyos will know that you don't tend to think of salmon in these semi-desert region. And in fact, look at this. They're defying all expectation, and they're going up in some really huge numbers over the last couple of years. So you can have some, again, surprises. This is down partly to excellent stewardship and management by some of the local people, including the local First Nations people who are very active in restoration here. But it's also due to some very good luck with their oceanic survival for reasons we don't fully understand. Now, the Fraser salmon, which are in the news so much lately, here's an idea of what the total run size, that's the total number of fish coming back each year, has looked like through time. Like the Skeena, we had good news, good build-up to the early 1990s and downward since. So here's the world's largest salmon-producing river in most years, the Fraser, and here is what's been going on, and it's been coming down ever since. The spawners, these are the fish that actually survive to get through the fishery, and to their credit, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has enabled quite a lot of fish still to come back compared to the early days here to spawn, even as the total returns have been going down. So in other words, there have been fisheries closures and reductions in the fisheries and great hardships to the people who depend on the fishing industry, as well as First Nations people who depend on these as on the food fisheries here. This is a somewhat more sobering way to look at the same thing. These are the adults' returns per spawner. And so these are the number of fish that come back per fish of the previous generation that produced them. And you can see really we've been on a slide, again, since about 1992. And this collapse of 2009, in fact, when you look at it this way, was right on the track. This is right about, this follows the trend. This was not seen in the forecasts that are done by the Pacific Salmon Commission, because their forecasting methods, which are always imprecise, as they always will be, because it's very hard to predict how many fish are going to come back 2 years later, but they were not accounting for these kinds of overall changes in productivity. As the numbers per spawner came down, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans reduced fishing mortality on them. So they have been quite responsive in reducing the fishery to allow those remaining fish to make it to the spawning grounds. Okay, here's the observed number in 2009 last year and the forecast. You can see the forecast was way off, okay? Not even close. And then here we are this year. There's the forecast. It was about the same, and oops, okay. That was pretty good. So this was due to a couple of factors, and we could talk about that in the discussion. We don't really know, and the Cohen Commission of Inquiry, the judicial inquiry, is trying to understand these kinds of problems. But I will say that really forecasting returns of fish is like forecasting the weather 2 years in advance. It's certainly no easier than that. Just a couple thoughts. We have different values for salmon, and one of the things that as a society we have to grapple with is, what are these fish for? Are they for, clearly they're for First Nations food fisheries. The Canadian Constitution is very clear about that. But we have the commercial interests, the recreational interests, and ecosystem importance of salmon. And one of the things that people are grappling with right now in the Cohen Commission and elsewhere is how do you decide to deal with these competing trade-offs? What are these fish for? Who gets the fish, and how can we look after ecosystem values of these fish as well as the other people who depend on them? That's a problem generally in sustainability, and I think it underlies a number of the other issues that we've been hearing about. So thank you. I'll leave it there.